Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our January History Happy Hour. As everybody starts to come into the room, I'm going to talk a little bit about things that we have going on in the next couple of months here at the museum before we turn it over to Dr. Young. We are starting to ramp up our season here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. In March, we're going to have our 2023 symposium, 5 Crucial Days to Gettysburg. Registration is open for that. Cody is going to actually drop the registration link into the chat. I didn't introduce Cody or myself. My name is Pete Mealy. I am the Executive Director here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. And Cody, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cody Yates, Director of Education and Museum Operations here at Seminary Ridge.
So we talked about the symposium. Cody, do you want to talk a little bit about what we have coming up in February for our History Happy Hour?
Certainly. Next month on Friday, February 17th, we'll be having licensed battlefield guide Jeff Harding. He's going to be on to talk about his latest book, Gettysburg's Lost Love Story, the ill-fated romance of General John Reynolds and Kate Hewitt. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Jeff and his work or that book. We're going to fit it into that Valentine's Day theme of this romance between the fallen General Reynolds and Kate Hewitt, a famous human interest story. And of course, as some of you who have been through our exhibits might know, we have a handkerchief on display for the past several years on loan from Gettysburg National Military Park that is embroidered for Reynolds, it seems, by Kate Hewitt. So that should be an engaging talk with Jeff Harding.
We're always thinking about thematic here, and that fits Valentine's. Nothing like a jilted love story for Valentine's Day. And then in March, we don't have a title yet, but our own Annette Jorgensen, our Membership and Development Coordinator, is going to talk about women's history in the Civil War. So that will be, believe it or not, on St. Patrick's Day. So a perfect time to have a History Happy Hour. And then in April, I'm really excited about the topic that we have coming up in April. We sort of came up with this standing around the water cooler. Cody, Caleb, and I are each going to take 15 minutes to tell our favorite story or stories about Seminary Ridge, about the museum building, Schmucker Hall, interesting stories that we have discovered over time, including the time that a deer broke through the window into the building and wreaked havoc. It doesn't just happen at the Blue and Gray Bar and Grill, if you've seen the Gettysburg newspaper. So you'll want to join us for that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Cory James Young. I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Young through a course that I was taking at Penn State Harrisburg in local and regional history on the Civil War in Pennsylvania. And Dr. Young was good enough to zoom into that class and talked about his research, and I loved it so much and was so impressed by it that I asked him to give a talk here. So Dr. Cory James Young is a historian of abolition and slavery in the American North. He received his PhD at Georgetown University and is currently a postdoctoral associate at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. His book manuscript, quote, For Life or Otherwise, Pennsylvania Slavery in the Age of Gradual Abolition, is under contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press. And he also just recently accepted a job as an assistant professor of history at the University of Iowa starting next fall. So thank you for being here, Dr. Young, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get my PowerPoint up because I want to make sure I can share some images with all of you and not just talk at you. I'd like to thank Peter and Cody for having me tonight and for facilitating this talk, and for everyone in the audience for joining. You know, it's a Friday evening, and I'm grateful to share some of my research with everyone. I'm hoping to speak for between 30 and 40 minutes. I'll keep an eye on the time and make sure that we have some space at the end for questions and conversations. So the title of my talk tonight is Abolition, Slavery, and Patience in Adams County. And I want to start with the image that you see here. This is not a watercolor, but an oil painting called A Ferry Scene on the Susquehanna at Wright's Ferry near Havre de Grace. And it was completed at around the start of the War of 1812 by a Russian painter named Pavel Petrovich Svinyan. And I start here because it's a rare image of Black men in the lower Susquehanna River Valley from this time period. And I can zoom in a little bit on this portrait. You see these three figures, at least one of whom, the center figure, is clearly depicted as African American, but also the soldier on the far right seems pretty clearly to be a Black soldier, and the gentleman rowing on the far left could well be African American too. And I know those of you who are from the area look at this title and like, okay, Wright's Ferry near Havre de Grace, you might know that that's Columbia, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster County, and those are 40 miles apart. But Pavel Svinyan did not know the area that well, so I sort of take this as a lower Susquehanna Valley scene, but also a reminder that Black men, and indeed enslaved Black men, were in this region at this time period along this river. So setting the scene. I want to give a bit of background on my research before talking more about Adams County. So as Peter said, I'm a historian of abolition and slavery in the American North. My book manuscript focuses on Pennsylvania. I'm mostly interested in the ways that slavery survived the American Revolution, survived the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, and became a new kind of bondage in the 19th century. And I can talk briefly about how this happened. So, as some of you may know, Pennsylvania enacts the first U.S. gradual abolition law in 1780 during the Revolutionary War. It's the first northern state to pass a bill like this. It becomes a model for gradual abolition throughout the North. And this law mandated that enslavers would register the people that they were claiming as lifetime slaves by November 1st of that year. So it gave them several months to register people at the county courthouse. And the idea behind this was that by creating a record of who was enslaved for life, you would be able to distinguish between individuals born before the act was passed and those born after, who would have a different kind of status. And I'll get to that different kind of status in a moment because it's key to the work that I do. But I wanted to point out that 3 York County assemblymen voted for the law, while 2 voted against it. And I'm talking about York County because in 1780, Adams County had not yet been incorporated. That wouldn't happen until 1799. So the area that becomes Adams County, there are 5 assemblymen from York, 3 who vote for this law and 2 who vote against it. Compare that actually to Lancaster County, right across the Susquehanna, where 3 Lancaster County assemblymen voted for it, but 8 voted against it. So a strong majority from the Lancaster delegation was not in favor of gradual abolition in Pennsylvania. And I think considering these two counties, York and Lancaster, we think, or we would do well to think about German Americans, the German American influence. And there's a bit of a myth that German Americans were, universally anti-slavery, and thus was just not the case. So if you forgive a quick digression, if we look at the religious affiliations of the assemblymen who vote for this law, you can actually see that the German Lutherans and the German Reformed members of the assembly disproportionately oppose this bill compared to members with other religious affiliations. And, there aren't as many of them as, say, the Presbyterians, but they're voting as a bloc against gradual abolition in 1780. Another thing we might look at, and this is a source that I found while doing my dissertation research, and I found it really surprising because of what I'd learned about German hostility to slavery generally. German language runaway slave advertisements appeared throughout this region, and I've translated it for us today. You can see that a non-German, a man named Robert McKelvin, was advertising for the return of a man he enslaved named James. And you can read over this advertisement if you like, but what I want to key into are two facts: that he was able to work with horses, and that McKelvin was trying to re-enslave, capture James in 1813. And I think these two pieces of information are important because if we go back to this portrait, right, or this landscape from Pavel's Finian, it forces us to consider the possibility that this is not a free Black Pennsylvanian or an enslaved Marylander, but could well have been an enslaved Pennsylvanian who plying the waterways in the early 19th century, right? The War of 1812, this is 3 decades after Pennsylvania has enacted its gradual abolition law. Gradual is a very key word in understanding how slavery disappeared from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Getting back to the overview, a second law passed in 1788 required that enslavers also register the children of the individuals that they were claiming as lifetime slaves. And they had to register these children who had to serve for 28 years under a system that I call statutory term slavery, right? We can break this term down. It's statutory because it's following from this specific statute, and it's term slavery as distinct from lifetime slavery. And this was how Black bondage was going to disappear from Pennsylvania. You have 2 lists now, right? Those who are registered as enslaved for life, those who are registered as enslaved for a term. And once those children grow up, well, the idea is that there will be no more slavery in Pennsylvania. However, enslavers, lawyers, the educated, read Pennsylvania's gradual abolition statutes in such a way that rather than confining this statutory term slavery, these 28-year sentences, to 1 generation, they permitted the registration of multiple generations of Black children, creating a kind of hereditary term slavery. So that if you were a Black woman born and registered as a lifetime slave before 1780, and you had a daughter who was registered as a slave for a term, who then grew up and became pregnant and had a child before her period of service was up, so before she turns 28, right? You could register that child as well. And so there was this hereditary form of bondage that replaces lifetime slavery as the primary form of unfreedom, of bondage that Black Pennsylvanians are experiencing in the early 19th century. At the time of the first federal census, there are almost 4,000 enslaved people in Pennsylvania, 500 of whom live in York County, again, which includes Adams County, which actually makes this region the center of slavery in the Commonwealth. No other county at the time of the first federal census had as many enslaved people as York, which is, again, York and Adams. So it's a bit of background. What you're looking at here is the actual, the title of the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery from the original document itself, the engrossed copy the formal copy for the state legislature. And the reason I like to show this image is because the clerk, in his zealousness to embellish the title here, ran out of space and actually has to truncate the word abolition. And I like to think of this as a symbolic reminder of the weight of the word gradual in this act, right? Gradual takes up so much space that abolition becomes something less than complete abolition. All right, so a map of Pennsylvania. Why am I showing you a map of Pennsylvania? Well, part of my research was locating the registries that I was telling you about. Once I began to discover that these lifetime slave and term slave registries had survived, I realized I had a project on my hand. This was the source base that allowed me to really delve into the lives of enslaved Pennsylvanians and the people who claimed them as property. And these sources exist for a lot of counties, but tragically, not for Philadelphia and not for York. And because Adams County was not its own county in 1780, this means we do not have a complete set of records for Adams County. What we have for Adams are the registrations of the children, the term enslaved children, beginning in 1800 after Adams was incorporated as its own county. So we do have records for Adams, but not nearly as many as we do for, say, the neighboring counties of Lancaster and Cumberland and Dauphin, even, where we have complete records that allow us to do a much more longitudinal study of slavery in this time period. Between 1800 and 1820, some 57 enslavers registered 109 children as their property in Adams County. 1800 to 1820, we know this from the surviving county slave registry, which I'll show an image of in just a little bit. In most other counties besides Adams, the registries end in 1826, not in 1820. And I'll talk about why again in a moment. But Adams is unique for the fact that the records end in 1820. And I have a hypothesis for why this may have been. In 1820, Adams County State Assemblyman William Miller introduces a bill into the House of Representatives, the state House of Representatives, called an act authorizing courts in this Commonwealth to direct certain evidence to correct in recording Negro or mulatto children. So that's a mouthful, right? This act does not pass, but it's clear from the title that what Miller wanted was for a law that would allow a new kind of evidence to alter these registration documents. And why would Miller want to let Adams County enslavers alter these documents? Well, under Pennsylvania law, if there was any sort of problem with these documents, if these registrations were incomplete, if they were not filled out correctly, say they left out the enslaved person's name or their birthday, or if it was somehow unclear that the enslaver had complied with the letter of the law, well, then that was cause for freedom. It would permit the enslaved people themselves to sue for freedom. You could do that if you had a faulty registration. And so clearly Miller is wanting to pass a law that allowed the residents of Pennsylvania, but specifically Adams County, to correct, to fix these records. Presumably, Adams County residents had gotten in the habit of doing something wrong, because the act does not pass. And Adams County's records just stop in 1820. I do not know what they were doing wrong. I do not know what William Miller wanted, but if any of you know, I would love to find out. And I should say, this is the William Miller of the Miller family who owned the Fairview or the Fairfield Inn in southern Adams County, one of the oldest inns in the country, really. So that is William Miller and a bit of history about the Adams County Slave Registry. So I said I would talk about 1826. This is a really key year in the history of Pennsylvania slavery. It's also a key year in Adams County history and for the history of your institution, because it is the year, as I'm sure many of you know, that Samuel Schmucker establishes the seminary in Gettysburg, which is now the Seminary Ridge Museum. But more crucially for my work, it is the year that the state Supreme Court passes an important legal decision. What is this legal decision? Well, this is a case that abolished hereditary term slavery in Pennsylvania. So recall, I said it was legal in Pennsylvania to register multiple generations of Black children as property. This was legal until 1826, nearly 50 years after the original Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery was passed. And so in 1826, when it's no longer legal to register multiple generations of children, the registrations in all of the other counties they stop. Because at this point, almost everyone who was being registered was the child of a servant, of a term slave, not of a lifetime slave. So in my analysis, abolition in Pennsylvania really can't be said to have occurred in a meaningful way until 1826, rather than, say, 1780. And again, it's just a coincidence that this is the same year that your seminary is being established. Oh, I've got plenty of time. Excellent. So, 1826, no more hereditary term slavery. But what of the young Black Pennsylvanians who had experienced hereditary term slavery? Would they have any justice? Well, in a very important sense, no, because shortly after this decision, a man named Samson Johnston sued for damages on the grounds that he had been held as a hereditary term slave. His mother, Jane, was not enslaved for life. She was born after 1780. She was enslaved for a term. And so when Samson Johnston was registered, it was as a hereditary term slave, not a statutory term slave. And the court had just declared that this was against Pennsylvania's abolition statute. And so he sues for damages, saying, I should never have been enslaved for a term under this law. The court said that that was a poor reading of the law. And this case comes out of Cumberland County. He actually wins at the county level in the trial court. The jury agrees that he should not have been held in bondage, and they award him the equivalent of about $10,000 of damages in 2023 dollars. But his enslaver appeals to the state Supreme Court, which in 1831 overturned the decision of the lower court, took away the award of damages, and basically said that they basically said that until the Supreme Court clarified the legal status of hereditary term slaves, it had not been illegal, and that he could not claim after the fact that he knew what his status was at the time. It gets complicated, but what it boils down to is that despite the fact that the court agreed he should never have been held under the best reading of Pennsylvania's abolition law, it didn't change the fact that he had been, and he essentially had consented to the labor that he had given. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, even though this case comes out of Cumberland County and it's heard in Franklin County, in Chambersburg, when the state Supreme Court is riding circuit, Samson Johnston had actually been enslaved as a teenager in Adams County, in Liberty Township. He was sold multiple times from York County to Cumberland County into Adams County. And we actually know this from an incredibly difficult to read archival source. It didn't make its way into the published state Supreme Court report. It's only in the trial record. And I found this in the Cumberland County Archives. It is a pain in the butt to read, but the key phrase here is that the Negro Samson was the property of Nathaniel Randolph of Liberty Township, Adams County. And so that's how we know this really important story of the history of slavery and abolition in Pennsylvania has this Adams County component. Samson lived and worked in Adams County before suing for damages a little bit north in Carlisle. So that's kind of the background of my work, my research, with some detours into Adams County in the lower Susquehanna River Valley. And I want to take the next 10, 15 minutes or so and really dive into Adams County itself. And I thought a good focus for this audience in particular might be religion and religious affiliation among, I should say, enslavers in Adams County. I don't know nearly as much as I would like about the formerly enslaved, the religious practices of the formerly enslaved themselves. But let's talk a bit about religion and slavery. And specifically, I want to drill into the experiences of a handful of enslaved people who were held in bondage by high-ranking members in different Pennsylvania congregations. And I'm going to start with the Presbyterians. And this also affords me a brief opportunity to talk a bit about public history, because I want to talk about the Reverend Alexander Dobbin, who you may well know from living in Gettysburg, was the proprietor of what is now the historic 1776 Dobbin House Tavern. And I was looking on this site to learn a bit about how the site was talking about Alexander Dobbin. You might have anticipated, since I've brought him up, yes, he did hold people in slavery. But I went to the about page for this website, and hopefully this works. I want to pull it up for you. Are we still with me? Am I still screen sharing in the new tab, Peter?
Yeah, you're good. We can see it.
Perfect. This paragraph right here, Reverend Alexander Dobbin, who built the Dobbin House, was an early frontier pioneer who helped settle and civilize the area. Right? There's a lot of language we could really get into here. You know, he built the Dobbin House. Well, you know, maybe not. It's likely that he oversaw the construction of the Dobbin House. And the question of his civilizing of the area is, of course, very, very complicated. There's, we cannot deny that he was one of the earliest settlers in what becomes Adams County. But the question of civilization is that's a very value-laden term, especially when we're talking about people who owned other people, right? So you have that sentence, and then crucially, when they're talking about the history of the house here, they want to emphasize the fact that this house was a station on the Underground Railroad. And I'm not denying that the historic Dobbin House was a station on the Underground Railroad. There's been some literature about this. But what bothers me as a scholar of slavery and abolition in this region is that folks almost always want to start with the Underground Railroad. They almost always want to start with enslaved people from elsewhere coming to Pennsylvania in search of freedom. And I understand that is a much more uplifting story. But what I want to show you all now is that before this house was a stop on the Underground Railroad, it was home to people who were enslaved in Pennsylvania, because the Reverend Alexander Dobbin, you can see here in the clerk's record book of the Adams County Term Slave Registries, identified as a minister living in Cumberland Township in Adams County. You have 3 entries here in this book. Between 1800 and 1805, he registered 4 girls as his property for 28 years, Becky and Eliza, who are twins. Then you have Sal, and finally you have Amy. And you can see there's only a little bit of information given about these children, and these are the kinds of documents that I grapple with when I do this work. Unfortunately, in the Adams County registries, unlike in, say, Lancaster, for example, there's no record of the mothers of these children. But what we know from Alexander Dobbin's last will and testament, which was filed 3 years after he registers Amy, so in 1808, just a few years after all of this is happening, Dobbin makes his last will and testament, and in that document, he leaves a woman named Let to his wife, and says that his wife is going to inherit the remaining time of Let's service. And that's the only person he mentions in his last will and testament. He doesn't mention Becky or Eliza or Sal or Amy, which suggests to me that Let was their mother, and that it was understood that these children would follow Let to become the property of Dobbin's wife. Again, this is an educated guess. But what also says to me, the fact that Dobbin is leaving his wife Let's time, right? He's clarifying that she has a period of service left that he's transferring to his wife. This suggests to me that these children were hereditary term slaves, owing 28 years of labor because their mother did, rather than because their mother was a lifetime slave, right? Born before 1780. So I don't mean to be overly critical of the preservation work at the Dobbin Tavern. I don't know anything of their resources. I have not been there myself. But I do know that it is fairly common for historical sites to want to begin with the stories of the Underground Railroad, rather than grappling with the harder histories of slavery in Pennsylvania itself. Another example of this, until quite recently, Dickinson College in Carlisle didn't want to talk about its slaveholding history. They much preferred to start their African-American history after the Civil War with formerly enslaved Black men from Maryland who came to the college in search of a job. And this is beginning to shift. But it's important that as museum educators and as patrons of public history sites, we think about how best to present these complicated stories. So that's Presbyterianism. Next, I want to briefly talk about Catholicism. What you're looking at here is the Conewago Chapel in Conewago Township, also known as the Basilica of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a basilica of the Catholic Church that in the early Republic was owned and operated by the Jesuits. Now, Peter mentioned I did my PhD at Georgetown. Georgetown has for the last 7 years, COVID time, right? For the last 7 years has been grappling systemically with its history as a slaveholding institution. The Jesuits who ran Georgetown also had a church in what becomes Adams County. And as part of the work I did at Georgetown, we created an online archive of what's called the Georgetown Slavery Archive. And there are 2 men's stories I wanted to briefly touch on, Peter and Michael. So first is Peter. And you can read from the title here, An Injurious Manumission, Proceedings of the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen, May 5th, 1801. Basically what happened, and I'll just scroll down to the document. You can see the document here. Peter was enslaved by the Jesuits in what becomes Adams County. And the reason I don't have his registry is that he was most likely registered in what was then York County, that set of documents that has not been discovered yet. But the Jesuits are deciding whether or not to manumit Peter, probably thinking about the fact that abolition has come to Pennsylvania, however slowly it has. And they decide that to manumit, to liberate, to set free Peter in Pennsylvania would be injurious. It would set a bad precedent for the people who remained enslaved on their other properties throughout the mid-Atlantic, specifically in Maryland. And so instead, they allow Peter to purchase his freedom. They don't manumit him, they allow him to buy his own freedom. And he would have labored in service of Conewago Chapel. And then next is Michael. This is a runaway advertisement for Michael from 1822, so almost 22 years later. And Michael was hired out by a DC woman to Georgetown to work for the Jesuits at the university. And as part of his work, he was sent on errands, including to the chapel at Conewago, right, in Pennsylvania. So I want to talk about this because here's a reminder that even individuals who were enslaved elsewhere, in this case, Michael was enslaved in the District of Columbia in DC, because of the way Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law was written, he could be sent into the state to do errands. And it appears that he took advantage of this relative freedom of mobility to seek his own freedom. I do not know if he was recovered by the Jesuits at Georgetown, but I do know that he would have spent some time in Adams County. So those are the Catholics. And finally, I want to talk about the Lutherans. You're looking here at an image of Reverend Benjamin Schultz, who was a founding figure in the history of both the seminary and Gettysburg College. And while I don't have very much evidence about Schultz's slaveholding, I do not know what he felt personally about the institution. I do know that when he was a reverend in Maryland, in Hagerstown, there were enslaved people living in his household who provided for him. I do not know if he owned this family himself. You've got the name Benjamin Kurtz, and here you have 4 individuals, an older woman and 3 younger people, 2 girls and a boy, who are living in the Kurtz household in Hagerstown, Maryland, before he moves back to Pennsylvania. And this is just a reminder of the ubiquity of slavery in the United States during this time period, right? Even though Pennsylvania is moving toward abolition, and they very much are, the state continues to exist in a slaveholding country. And so there's all these complicated histories that flow from that very fact. So I want to end tonight with the last part of my title. I think I called it Abolition and Slavery and Patience in Adams County. In 1858, the Gettysburg compiler ran an advertisement, or not an advertisement, a notice called Death of an Old Slave. And I'm just going to read this advertisement. I work with so many advertisements. This obituary: died on the 4th of November last at Petersburg, York Springs, Patience Hack, but known more familiarly by the name of Old Tacey. Her age was nearly 100 years, and she was perhaps the only slave then alive in Adams County, or perhaps in the state. She was the survivor of a family of slaves belonging to the estate of Leonard Hatton. It's Hatton, not Hatter. Her husband and sons all having died long since. She was very kindly taken care of and supported by Thomas Stevens, Esquire, and Lady, his wife, up to the time of her death. So this notice for Patience Hack is evidence of the fact that slavery survived in Pennsylvania up until the eve of the Civil War itself. And indeed, there are more obituaries like this. Last slave notices. There are obituaries that continue into the Civil War and as late as 1864. That's the oldest I've found, although that one is from Pittsburgh, not from Adams County. And there's actually a lot more evidence that Pennsylvania never moved to total abolition, immediate emancipation. They let gradual abolition run its course. After 1826, the number of unfree people dropped substantially as individuals like Samson Johnston can no longer be held in hereditary term slavery. But folks like Patience, who was born before 1780, registered as a lifetime slave, they were never formally manumitted by statute. They were allowed to get older and pass away. And as they passed away, slavery, legal slavery, would die along with them. And in addition to this notice, we also have the 1850 US federal census. And this is so remarkable because 1850 is the first year that the US government issues separate slave censuses and free censuses. In Pennsylvania, they only used the free census. And so when the census taker got to Patience Hack, who also went by the name Patience Sib, I'm blowing up so you can see the text here. He had to write down the fact that she was a slave in the column for condition, whether or not a person was deaf, dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, a pauper, or a convict. So there's this column at the very end there that he chooses to say, no, her condition is slave. Her birthplace is listed as unknown. She's identified as an 85-year-old Black woman, which lends credence to the fact that she was almost 100 years when she passed away almost 10 years later, right? This is a woman who may well have remained legally enslaved up to the time of her death. I do want to say, however, that the notice of her death says she was very kindly taken care of and supported by Thomas Stevens up to the time of her death. Well, in 1850, she was living in someone else's household, the household of Phoebe Pearson. So the story is more complicated than this notice alone would suggest. But this is a really crucial piece of evidence for understanding that gradual abolition meant gradual. It meant slow. It meant we are going to let abolition occur on its own timeline. And when the last person who was legally enslaved died in Pennsylvania, then the institution would be gone with it. That's how slavery disappeared from Pennsylvania. And, I started this talk earlier by talking about symbolism and the symbolism of the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, with the word abolition just cut in two. Well, this too is remarkably symbolic. A woman named Patience had to wait an entire lifetime until she could finally have her freedom in death. And that's part of the history of Pennsylvania abolition as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience. I hope I didn't go on for too long. We should have enough time for some conversation. I look forward to it.
This was great. Thank you. And if you have questions, you can raise your hand using the feature and we can unmute you. You can put your question in the chat and we'll get to it. I have a few, one of which is I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your data set.
Yeah. So I showed you that map of all of the surviving county slave registries. Once I started realizing that these existed all over the state, I just started writing them down and trying to systematically organize them. And Eventually, I had a data set of about 6,400 registrations of Black Pennsylvanians, about 1/3 who were enslaved for life, 2/3 their children, those who were enslaved for a term, from 15 different counties throughout the state. And I mentioned that remarkably, some of these counties, Lancaster, so I live in Lancaster County, Nebraska, and here they pronounce it Lancaster. But I'm much more familiar with Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But I've been here too long that I trip up over.
We'll give you a pass. You got to.
Thank you. But in Lancaster, they identified the names of the mothers, and that wasn't required by law. Someone just started doing it, and it became a habit. The clerk must have just started telling people to write down the name of the mother. And so in this one county, you can start reconstructing family trees of Black Pennsylvanians because we know who their mother was, and if they belonged to a family who continued to register people as property up until the 1820s, you start seeing the same names. And so in Cumberland County, I was able to reconstruct 4 generations of women who are, that's remarkable, not just because you can rarely do that during this time period, but in Cumberland County, those women sued for their freedom, citing a faulty registry, and they didn't win their case. But by 1826, it didn't matter anymore because someone did win their case.
Nancy asked, where did you find these census records and other research documents?
So the census records I accessed via ancestry.com. It's expensive. It's annoying that's the best place that you can go to look at facsimile reproductions of the records themselves. But that's a really good resource. I actually think Family Search allows you to look at the images too, but Ancestry is, I think, a lot more user-friendly. And the slave registries that I was talking about, some of those are only in archives. Some of them have been scanned by the Pennsylvania State Archives and are available online, but not all of them. Some of them only exist as transcripts of records that were written down later because originals have not survived. So for Pittsburgh, for example, we only know about the Pittsburgh registrations because at the turn of the 20th century, someone typed out the records, and I don't have the originals, but I have this remarkable act of early 20th century historical preservation, which I'm so grateful for. Some of these records only exist in published 19th century histories. Some antiquarian wrote everything down, and those tend to be the least detailed, but for a handful of counties, it's all we have. And so I started finding them in different kinds of places and I'm putting them all in one place with the hope that more folks will know about it, that it's easier to use, and that other people, genealogists even, can start doing different kinds of search queries.
Great. Dan asked, were York County pro-slavery attitudes influenced by proximity to Maryland? And as a follow-up, was there something about German Americans that made them more accepting?
Yeah, so the question of German Americans and slavery it's an old question in the literature. And I think what it really boils down to is that in Pennsylvania, the majority of the population were Scotch-Irish. The majority of the population were Presbyterian. So by contrast, it just seems like, very few German descended Pennsylvanians were involved in this institution. And that's true. By comparison, there were very few of them. But in the York and Adams County registries, I wrote this down earlier. You've got the names Eichelberger, Krantz, Spangler, Stehr, Herman, Hirsch, Kelleberger, Mundorf. All those names show up in the registries. So clearly not all German Americans. And as we saw from that breakdown of the votes in the General Assembly, were pro-slavery, or not all German Americans were anti-slavery at this time period. I think part of it is that German Americans later on in the national abolition movement become known as some radical abolitionists in the 19th century, but 18th century Pennsylvania is a different kind of place. So that's part of it. And
I think that's an important distinction to make, to look at the Pennsylvania Germans versus the revolutionaries of the 1850s.
Right. And there you have some Missouri Germans who, compared to other settlers in Missouri, have much different attitudes. And yes, York County pro-slavery attitudes is, of course, influenced by its proximity to Maryland. There are still border disputes going on during this time period. There are individuals who own land on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. And so just because that line is drawn in the sand and one state starts acting in a certain way, people are more complicated than that. So York and Adams County's proximity to Maryland, of course, is what allows for a pro-slavery impulse in the Revolutionary era, but it's also part of what makes them anti-slavery later in the 19th century, because there are more runaways. There are more slave coffles dipping into Pennsylvania as part of the domestic slave trade on their way to the Ohio River and the lower Mississippi Valley. So the proximity to Maryland at first is sort of a pro-slavery impulse, but later on, once Pennsylvania, and again, this is the really tricky part of what I do, I emphasize continuities in Pennsylvania's slaveholding history, but Pennsylvania is different from other states. It is moving toward abolition, no matter how slowly. And the fact that something could be a pro-slavery causation, proximity to Maryland, at one moment in time, that becomes an anti-slavery causation later in time, I think is what makes doing this history so rewarding, right? It's tricky stuff.
Barbara asked, what influence did the African-American churches have re-slaveries in their county?
So the Black churches in South Central Pennsylvania are anti-slavery forces, but they also don't really exist until the 1820s. There are insufficient numbers of Black Pennsylvanians to establish their own churches during the Age of Gradual Abolition, during the early Republic, that there are just very few of those organizations. Now, the Black church in Philadelphia, which is getting established earlier on in the 1780s and 90s, gets to play a more aggressive role in sort of fighting against slavery's continuation in Pennsylvania. But the Black churches in the Pennsylvania interior, around Gettysburg, in Harrisburg, in Carlisle, those churches are coming around later, and their role has much more to do with providing refuge for runaways from the South, and providing uplift for free Black families, rather than doing the anti-slavery work that I was just describing. Part of the reason more practical sort of. It's also just another. It's just a different time period. Something that I didn't get to write about in the dissertation, but I'm going to need to write about in the book, is Central Pennsylvania finds it very difficult to hang on to its Black population. They tend to go to Pittsburgh or to Philadelphia, where there are more opportunities, and I wouldn't say less racism per se, but a larger Black community to protect them from white racism. There are actually a handful of Black abolitionists who try to make a go of it in Carlisle, who basically just find that it's too hard. There isn't a good school. There isn't really an established church quite yet. And so in the early 1820s, they're establishing businesses and creating the nucleus of a free Black community in Carlisle. But then they all go to Pittsburgh. So that's part of what makes it so hard to get at Black voices in my research specifically, which focuses on the Pennsylvania interior. I don't really look at Philadelphia because that's where scholars tend to look. And if you remember the map I showed you, it wasn't just York where those registries haven't survived. They haven't survived in Philadelphia either. And because they haven't survived or haven't been discovered in Philadelphia, scholars who have written that history have written a very different kind of history because they were using a fundamentally different source base, right? They were working from the records of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which was headquartered in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia-based Pennsylvania Abolition Society had a much harder time policing Gettysburg and Harrisburg in Carlisle. It was further away. They didn't have as many resources. And that's part of the reason that slavery lasts longer in the rural interior than it does in the major cities in Pennsylvania.
Jeff asked about the Anabaptist sect and if they had a different attitude than other Pennsylvania German congregations.
I knew I was going to regret bringing up religion because my detailed knowledge of different religious groups is not as good as I would like it to be. I appreciate your question. I know that even, and these are not Anabaptists per se, but different Pennsylvania religious sects that became known as anti-slavery, Moravians, Quakers, these groups that settle east of the Susquehanna River. Before 1780, all those groups are still participating in slavery, right? They are not universally against the institution. It takes time. It's quite a long process. And so I unfortunately can't speak to the Anabaptists specifically, but you have me curious. And if I find out, I'll make sure to let you know.
That's why you do this, right? You get feedback that lately, this is why people go to conferences.
Right. Although actually, I wonder if the Anabaptists were on that, were on the chart that I used at the start.
I don't think I saw them, but one thing that did surprise me was on that, going back to that chart, was ex-Quaker.
Yeah,
was
so
identified, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
I can explain that actually. Thank you. So at the end of during the 7 Years' War, so in the 1750s and 60s, Quakers they were pacifists historically, and so they opposed the war, and that was really unpopular. And so, Pennsylvania is known as the Quaker state, the Quaker colony. The longer Pennsylvania Quakers were pacifist, the harder it became to hold on to political power. And so eventually Quakers basically retreated from politics. They were no longer leading the government of Pennsylvania. And so my guess is that ex-Quaker refers to the facts that these individuals had been Quakers or were from Quaker families, but chose to remain in politics, whereas most of their fellow congregants withdrew from the world of politics.
Interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
I'll ask one last question because we're coming up on 7:30, and maybe this is I don't know how this is going to go, but I'm just curious. Have you done any looking into gradual emancipation in other states in the North, and how the Pennsylvania experience compares to New Jersey, New York?
Yes. So briefly, Pennsylvania is unique in, I'll back up. Pennsylvania is known as the first state to enact a gradual abolition law. New Jersey is known as the last. For a long time, in 1804.
Yeah.
And the other states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, are all in between those states. For a long time, New Jersey was pointed to as the place that sort of held on the longest, made the most compromises, was the least committed to the program. What I have found is that Pennsylvania has a lot more in common with New Jersey than it has with the New England states or even New York. And the two key things there are the fact that it doesn't move to immediate emancipation. New York, Rhode Island, and Connecticut all move to immediate emancipation. New Jersey and Pennsylvania do not. And New Jersey is the only other state I've found that practiced hereditary term slavery, where the children could also serve. Although that scholarship is just now being done, the first article I read, like the first piece of evidence I saw that this was the case, was only published like a year or two ago, and it was the side project of a sociologist. And so, right, this work is still happening. But what I can tell you is that Pennsylvania, for better or worse, more in common with New Jersey than with the other states. And there's a certain geographical intuition here. Right? It is the southernmost. It has the longest border. I think it was just the fact that it acted first, right? It acted during the revolution that has changed the way people want to feel. And you know, it almost blinded some scholars to the trajectory of gradual abolition in Pennsylvania.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We've got a lot of very positive comments there in the chat. A lot of people are saying thought-provoking and wonderful lecture, and I truly believe that it was. And I really thank you for joining us this evening. I'm looking forward to the book. Congratulations on your new appointment there at the University of Iowa. Be sure to join us in February, on February 17th, I think. 17th, for Jeff Harding to talk about John Reynolds and Kate Hewitt. And we thank you and hope to see you again soon. And thanks, Dr. Young.
Great, thank you. If anyone has questions, they can always email me.
Yeah, and I have your email address, so you have to email me. Yeah, perfect. All right, take care.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.